Beneath the battlefields and burned cities, history has left us more than ruins. It has left sealed vaults, erased testimonies, and whispers of weapons that should never have existed. These are not tales etched into textbooks, but fragments buried in the margins. Cables cut short, reports struck through in black ink. When we read them, the pages feel alive, pulsing with a warning. What was hidden was never meant to see daylight again. On the morning of June 12, 1943, an interception unit stationed at Bletchley Park logged a series of encrypted naval messages between German command posts in La Spezia and Palermo. The decrypted fragments, labeled under ultra-reference HS 8376, suggested that a small but unusually well-escorted supply convoy was moving south through the Tyrrhenian Sea. Allied planners assumed the cargo would be munitions, possibly reinforcements for Axis positions in Sicily, where preparations for the Allied invasion were already underway. Yet the language of the messages was odd. Repeated emphasis on priority cargo and orders that escort vessels maintain absolute perimeter integrity. By late afternoon, the convoy was identified on British radar sweeps near Elba. The composition was unusual. A single large freighter of approximately 6,000 tons, flanked by 4 destroyers and 2 torpedo boats. The ship itself bore no visible armaments. Intelligence officers at Malta, reviewing the sighting reports, noted its superstructure had been modified to enclose the entire central deck. A naval officer scribbled in the margin of his report, "Not ordnance, something shielded. The Royal Navy ordered an immediate shadowing operation." That night, HMS Unrivaled, a U-class submarine patrolling off Corsica, reported visual contact with the freighter. In its patrol log, later archived as ADM 199-1845, the commander described the ship as silent running, with almost no deck lighting and crew visible only in fleeting shadows. He requested permission to attack, but was told to hold fire until confirmation of cargo could be established. That confirmation never came. At dawn on June 13th, a flight of Bristol Beaufighters from No. 272 Squadron RAF intercepted the convoy off Pianosa Island. They launched rockets against the escorting destroyers, heavily damaging one, but their primary target, the freighter, maneuvered erratically, avoiding direct hits. Radio transcripts indicate the aircraft were ordered to disengage after 10 minutes. The reason remains unclear. Surviving squadron reports contain redacted sections marked "Not for release." The convoy's trail vanishes after this encounter. According to Kriegsmarine records recovered in 1945, the freighter never reached Palermo. In fact, it does not appear in any surviving Axis naval logs after June 13th. Allied after-action reports listed the vessel as probably sunk, but no wreckage was ever located. Divers conducting post-war surveys of the Tyrrhenian seabed found nothing resembling a freighter of that class. To this day, its fate is absent from official naval loss registers. In 1952, a declassified CIA memorandum surfaced referencing a sealed file concerning an operation codenamed Harpoon. It alluded to sensitive recovery actions carried out by joint British-American units in the aftermath of the June 1943 engagement. The memo noted that cargo integrity was compromised, necessitating containment. No further detail was provided. The memorandum was signed by Alan Dulles, then head of OSS operations in Switzerland. Rumors circulated among naval veterans in Malta that summer. One destroyer crewman claimed to have seen the freighter burning briefly on the horizon before it disappeared behind smoke. Another insisted it had not sunk at all, but had been escorted under cover of darkness to an undisclosed anchorage, possibly Sardinia. None of these accounts can be verified. What can be confirmed is that several intelligence officers who worked on the case later transferred to specialized units dealing with unconventional weaponry research. Historians examining fragmentary German documents note a reference to Gerrit 74B, a project designation never fully explained in surviving files. The notation appears in an order from the Oberkommando der Marine, dated June 9, 1943, assigning maximum security to the transfer of unspecified equipment. Some speculate this referred to radar prototypes or chemical delivery systems. Others believe it may have been related to nuclear research. The lack of technical schematics has made verification impossible. The most striking clue surfaced in 1978 when Italian fishermen dredging near Monte Cristo Island recovered a corroded steel container stamped with Reich Eagle insignia. Inside were fragments of technical blueprints, illegible from seawater damage, and several reels of film stock. The Italian Navy seized the find, declaring it military property. The contents were never publicly displayed. Witnesses to the recovery later claimed the film reels were flown to the NATO base in Naples. Requests for declassification remain unanswered. Eyewitness fragments, redacted cables, and missing logs all suggest the Harpoon convoy carried something of immense strategic value, something never meant to be recorded in standard naval registers. The fact that both Allied and Axis records omit its conclusion points to deliberate suppression. Whether the cargo sank in the Tyrrhenian depths or was secretly recovered remains unresolved. What is certain is that in the summer of 1943, as Sicily braced for invasion, a single ship sailed under extraordinary protection and vanished without a trace, leaving behind only classified silences in the archives of war. When Soviet forces stormed Berlin in May 1945, the Red Army seized not only buildings and territory, but a staggering archive of Nazi documents. Among the most sought-after targets were scientific records, papers on propulsion, chemical warfare, and atomic research. Smersh units, the Soviet counterintelligence arm, were tasked with locating and transporting these materials directly to Moscow. Within weeks, dozens of crates marked with Reich insignia and sealed under armed guard were shipped by rail into the Soviet Union. They were logged as specimens, stored not in a military warehouse, but beneath the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, the headquarters of the NKVD. Western intelligence became aware of the existence of these files when captured. German scientists began to vanish. According to testimonies collected during Operation Paperclip, men who were supposed to be transferred into American custody, engineers from Peenemünde, specialists in acoustics and metallurgy, were instead listed as missing. One witness, the engineer Hans Kammler, told interrogators that colleagues had been taken east. Kammler himself disappeared in May 1945, his last known sighting reported in Prague, though Soviet records deny holding him. The so-called Moscow Vault quickly became an obsession for Allied analysts. Declassified OSS cables from 1946 mentioned that valuable enemy research was being conducted under Soviet supervision. The cables noted that the NKVD had established special sections in Lubyanka for interrogations, designed not for information about troop movements or war crimes, but for extracting technical expertise. Files discovered decades later in the Russian State Archive reference Interrogation Series 17B, involving prolonged questioning of scientists on atomic and radiological topics. The phrasing is deliberately vague. One of the earliest hints of the vault's contents came from Soviet defectors in the early 1950s. A former NKVD officer, interviewed by the British in Vienna, recalled an underground archive beneath Lubyanka that held hundreds of crates, sealed and numbered, contents unknown except to a few. He claimed the interrogations often involved presenting the prisoners with their own confiscated notes, forcing them to elaborate on calculations, prototypes, and unfinished weapons projects. According to his testimony, many of these men were never seen again after their work concluded. Their families in Germany received no notification of death or imprisonment. Western intelligence agencies began compiling fragmented reports under the code name Red Vault. The CIA's 1951 assessment suggested that Soviet advances in rocketry and jet propulsion bore uncanny resemblance to abandoned German designs, raising suspicions that the Lubyanka files had been put to direct use. The report highlighted the rapid development of the R-2 missile, whose design strongly mirrored the German V-2. Yet Moscow denied all claims, dismissing them as propaganda. Within Soviet archives themselves, tantalizing references appear, but quickly disappear. A memorandum dated February 1946 mentions material transfer from Berlin regarding Jarette 509 and Jarette 712, codenames of unknown designation. Another refers cryptically to interview with Subject 42 concerning resonance calculations. Beyond these passing mentions, the trail goes cold. Large portions of the documentation remain classified or were deliberately destroyed during later archival purges. What is clear is that the Moscow vault operated outside normal judicial or scientific channels. Prisoners were not registered as inmates but as technical detainees. A 1948 NKVD budget report lists expenditures for scientific materials processing at Lubyanka, an odd entry for a counterintelligence agency. The same report contains line items for laboratory containment and secure transportation, suggesting that the materials stored there were not just papers, but possibly physical prototypes or hazardous substances. The Western fear of what the Soviets had uncovered reached its peak during the early Cold War. British MI6 documents from 1949 warned of advanced delivery systems being developed by the USSR, possibly derived from German research hidden in the vault. One particularly chilling speculation was that bacteriological agents, tested by the Nazis but never deployed, had been transferred into Soviet hands. The files note unconfirmed reports of specimen storage requiring refrigeration and controlled environment. Despite decades of inquiry, no complete inventory of the Moscow vault has ever surfaced. Researchers attempting to track down the fate of specific scientists often reach dead ends. Records vanish, prisoner numbers are falsified, and death certificates are conspicuously absent. Some suggest the Soviet authorities deliberately erased these individuals to prevent Western intelligence from even confirming their survival. The few scattered documents that have emerged indicate a systematic program of exploitation. Scientists were interrogated not for confessions of guilt, but for knowledge, equations, blueprints, technical language. One American intelligence officer described it as a theft not of objects but of minds. The vault was less a prison than a shadow laboratory, extracting fragments of the Reich's unfinished future. To this day, Russian authorities maintain silence about what was held beneath Lubyanka in the late 1940s. Whether the archives still exist, transferred to successor institutions or quietly destroyed remains unknown. What survives is only the outline, crates of documents, vanished scientists, and whispered testimonies of interrogations that were never meant to end. The Moscow vault remains one of the Cold War's most enduring mysteries, a sealed chamber of stolen knowledge buried deep beneath the stone walls of a prison, locked away from history itself. In the closing weeks of 1944, as German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, a series of strange reports began to filter into Allied command posts. Pilots of the Royal Air Force and the US Army Air Forces described encounters with unidentified Luftwaffe aircraft flying at unprecedented speeds, appearing suddenly and vanishing into low cloud cover before any pursuit could be mounted. The reports logged between December 18th and January 3rd spoke of bombers, larger than the Me-262 jet fighters already known to Allied intelligence, but stripped of recognizable markings, with wings that seemed narrower, sleeker, more experimental. Among American ground units, they quickly became known as ghost bombers. The first recorded sighting occurred on December 22nd, when Captain Harold Whitaker of the 365th Fighter Group intercepted what he thought was a formation of Ju-88s over Bastogne. Instead, he reported seeing two large aircraft, jet-propelled, no-tail insignia, accelerating beyond P-47 capability within seconds. His after-action report, preserved in the Air Historical Branch file AIR 40201, was marked with red ink. Unconfirmed, possible misidentification. Yet similar descriptions soon surfaced from RAF night fighter crews, who swore they engaged twin-engine silhouettes with no propellers, emitting a roaring flame exhaust. The existence of jet-powered bombers was not entirely beyond imagination. Allied intelligence had already confirmed German work on the Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet bomber. But the dimensions described by pilots in the Ardennes did not match the R-234's profile. These craft were larger, with fuselages designed for heavy payloads. Some insisted they bore resemblance to the Junkers EF-132, a project supposedly still on paper. Others speculated about the Heinkel P-1078 series, though none were believed to have left the prototype stage. Yet Allied radar stations along the Meuse registered anomalous high-speed blips during those weeks, corroborating at least part of the eyewitness claims. When the Ardennes offensive collapsed in January 1945, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force ordered an investigation into the reports. A small intelligence detachment, Section G2 Air, was dispatched to Bavaria in April 1945, tasked with locating any remaining Luftwaffe prototypes. Their search led them to Lechfeld Airfield near Augsburg, where abandoned hangars contained the shattered remains of conventional Me-262s and R-234s. However, one hangar, sealed with explosives and rigged for demolition, yielded something different. Inside, investigators discovered incomplete fuselage frames resembling heavy jet bombers, partially dismantled and lacking engines. These were tagged Project Eisenfaust in the provisional report, a code name never found in surviving German. Documentation. The report, filed under Schaf Intel 53145, was brief and heavily redacted. It noted advanced bomber prototypes, estimated range intercontinental, production incomplete. Several photographs were taken but classified immediately. Curiously, after 1946, the designation Eisenfaust disappears entirely from U.S. Army Air Forces records, replaced with the generic label captured jet material. Researchers attempting to trace the files in the 1970s discovered entire folders missing from the National Archives, with reference numbers skipped, as though erased. German records offer little clarity. Luftwaffe production logs make no mention of a program named Eisenfaust, and surviving engineers deny knowledge of such a project, yet testimonies collected during post-war interrogations suggest otherwise. One technician from Heinkel's Marienhehe facility told British interrogators that a special squadron had been formed in late 1944, staffed by test pilots loyal to the SS rather than the Luftwaffe. He claimed they flew prototype bombers without insignia from an airfield in Thuringia. His account was dismissed at the time as exaggeration, but it echoed the strange sightings over the Ardennes. The possibility that at least one squadron of experimental bombers was operational has fueled decades of speculation. Allied intelligence officers in 1945 openly debated whether the sightings were genuine or a product of combat stress. Yet the physical discovery of incomplete prototypes complicates the dismissal. If Germany had indeed tested heavy jet bombers, in the final months of the war, why were they erased so thoroughly from the record? In 1950, a U.S. Air Force intelligence briefing, declassified in part during the 1990s, referenced unverified reports of captured jet prototypes transferred to USSR custody, 1945. It suggested that elements of Operation Lusty, the American program to seize German aviation technology, may have been compromised by Soviet units, moving deeper into Thuringia before US forces arrived. If true, the prototypes might not have been destroyed at all but spirited eastward for evaluation. Soviet long-range bomber designs of the late 1940s bore suspicious similarities to German blueprints never officially recovered. The ghost bomber sightings have never been conclusively explained. Official histories of the Ardennes offensive make no mention of unidentified jet bombers, and the classified Eisenfaust report remains missing. Yet fragments of testimony, scattered photographs and anomalies in archival numbering suggest a deliberate erasure. Whether the bombers were merely prototypes that never flew, or whether a handful of sorties were conducted in desperation, remains an open question. For the men on the ground in 1944, the memory persisted. Sergeant William Holden of the 506th Parachute Infantry recalled hearing a terrible roar overhead, not like piston engines, but a scream that rattled the earth. He never saw the aircraft, but his testimony echoes others. To those who survived, Bastogne, the memory of unidentified engines in the winter sky was never forgotten. And to historians combing through what remains of the archives, Operation Eisenfaust stands as one of the war's most carefully buried mysteries. The possibility that the Reich briefly put into the air weapons meant for a future war that never came. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under advancing Allied armies, the Austrian Alps became the stage for desperate acts of concealment. Nazi officials, SS units, and fleeing intelligence officers carried crates of documents, currency, and unknown cargo into the remote valleys of the Salzkammergut. Local testimony later confirmed what many had long suspected. Much of this material was deliberately sunk into the black glacial waters of Lake Toplitz. For decades afterward, divers, intelligence teams, and treasure hunters sought what lay beneath. What they found was only fragments, and what official records omit is often more revealing than what they contain. The first documented recovery attempt occurred in 1946 under the supervision of U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, CIC. A classified memorandum archived as CIC Ops Yuan 1246 describes limited dive operations conducted with Austrian guides. Divers recovered waterlogged crates filled with counterfeit British banknotes, remnants of Operation Bernhard, the Reich's scheme to destabilize Allied economies through forged currency. The discovery was significant, but the report's appendix listed additional unopened containers, too deep to retrieve with the available equipment. The file's final page, redacted in later releases, refers cryptically to non-currency, contents of sensitive nature. British interest quickly escalated. MI6 memoranda from 1947, declassified decades later, indicate that intelligence officers suspected the lake concealed not only currency, but also classified Reich records pertaining to foreign operations. The documents reference the possibility of war crimes archives and materials relating to non-conventional research. The phrasing aligns with Allied concerns about Nazi chemical and biological programs, much of which remained undocumented at war's end. Yet subsequent British dive teams reported little success, often citing dangerous conditions, low visibility, entangling logs, and silt that swallowed equipment. Local villagers, however, recalled unusual activity. Between 1947 and 1949, armed patrols restricted access to Lake Toplitz. Shepherds and fishermen reported night operations, barges with floodlights, crates hoisted from the depths, and foreign soldiers speaking English and Russian. These accounts, dismissed officially as rumor, are consistent with scattered entries in US Navy diving logs, which list temporary detachments in Austria during the same years, an odd deployment for naval personnel in an inland lake. In around 1953, Austrian authorities, attempting to reassert control, granted permission for limited civilian diving expeditions. That summer, a team led by Dr. Hans Frustuek recovered several sealed metal containers. Inside were not banknotes but damaged files, many bearing the stamp of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, the SS Intelligence Office. The papers, mostly illegible, contained references to Mittelwerk, wie Waffen, and a series of codenames unfamiliar to historians. Before the press could examine the find, Austrian police seized the documents and transferred them to Vienna. Their chain of custody ended abruptly. No public record confirms where they were archived. More troubling are the testimonies of divers involved in that recovery. One recalled opening a half-collapsed crate that contained canisters metal with stenciled warnings in German. Before he could retrieve them, the Austrian gendarmerie ordered the dive terminated. Another claimed to have seen a rusted cylinder exuding a pungent chemical odor, though no sample was ever taken. These accounts, though unverified, fueled speculation that Lake Toplitz hid more than forged currency, that it contained remnants of chemical warfare stockpiles, or worse. American interest re-emerged in 1955, just as Austria regained sovereignty, under the State Treaty. A CIA memorandum dated September that year, declassified in fragments in 2001, noted joint Anglo-American dives conducted under cover of scientific research. The memorandum confirmed the recovery of sealed containers containing photographic negatives and undeveloped film. The images, reportedly sent to London, were never published. One page of the memo contains the typed remark, "Evidence," suggests intentional concealment of records relating to overseas networks, material too sensitive for dissemination. The lake itself became a symbol of suppressed history. Each new expedition recovered counterfeit notes and little else, while the more disturbing possibilities, the rumored steel vaults, the mysterious cylinders, the missing archives, remained, officially unacknowledged. Austrian authorities eventually banned further dives, citing safety concerns, though many suspected pressure from occupying powers had shaped the decision. The ban did little to stop whispers that NATO intelligence had already stripped the depths of their most valuable contents. To this day, the question lingers. What was thrown into Toplitz as the Reich fell? The known evidence, Bernhard currency, RSHA files, undeveloped film, suggests an archive far more expansive than mere financial sabotage. The consistent redactions in Allied files hint at materials too sensitive for public release. Records of foreign collaborators, technological experiments, or evidence of war crimes erased before tribunals could convene. What was concealed in those alpine waters may never be fully known. What remains certain is that the Black Archive of Lake Toplitz was not an accident of war. It was a deliberate burial, carried out under orders and sealed beneath a lake whose dark silence continues. To shield the Reich's final secrets. In 1961, Polish construction crews working outside the town of Otwock, southeast of Warsaw, unearthed a reinforced tunnel system while clearing ground for a new housing estate. What initially appeared to be an abandoned Wehrmacht shelter quickly revealed itself to be more elaborate. A complex of interconnected bunkers, sealed behind blast doors and camouflaged by collapsed earth. Local authorities notified the Polish Security Service, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa (SB), which in turn alerted Soviet advisors. Within weeks, the site was sealed off, its existence noted in classified correspondence between Warsaw and Moscow. What investigators found inside would remain hidden for decades. The first bunker chamber contained crates of standard military equipment, helmets, field radios, rusted weapons. But deeper inside, investigators discovered metal cabinets bolted to the walls, each drawer packed with files. Many bore the emblem of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA, the SS Intelligence Office, along with date stamps that should not have existed, 1947, 1948, even 1949. This immediately raised alarms. The Reich had been destroyed in May 1945, yet here were records apparently created years later. The documents catalogued partisan activity, resistance networks, and, most disturbingly, lists of Allied agents in Central Europe. Some names were already known to have been executed by Soviet or Polish authorities in the late 1940s. A joint Soviet-Polish report, classified as Silver Anvil, was compiled in early 1962. Declassified fragments obtained after 1991 describe the discovery of intelligence files of uncertain authorship, bearing German origin, indicating continuity beyond 1945. The report speculated that surviving Nazi intelligence officers had maintained operations clandestinely, possibly under the supervision of a shadow network that outlived the war. One annotation in the margin, written in Russian, read simply, "or disinformation," suggesting that even the Soviets were uncertain whether the files were genuine relics of a hidden German organization or carefully planted fabrications. The bunker itself appeared operational long after 1945. Chemical analysis of lantern oil residues suggested usage in the early 1950s. Food tins stamped with Polish manufacturers. Marks carried expiration dates from 1951. Forensic study of handwriting in the files revealed multiple contributors, some trained in Germanic script, others using Cyrillic annotations. To Western analysts who later reviewed fragments of the Silver Anvil report, this suggested not a Nazi holdout, but a hybrid intelligence operation. Possibly Soviet agents appropriating German documentation to monitor their own sphere of control, while concealing their involvement. Yet one section of the archive resisted such interpretation. Among the cabinets was a series of meticulously typed dossiers marked Auswärtige Aktionen. These included surveillance reports on émigré communities in South America, detailed to a level of precision impossible without direct contacts. One file described the movements of a former Gestapo officer in Buenos Aires as late as 1952. Another tracked German industrialists resettled in Chile. The level of access suggested a network extending far beyond Poland's borders. Whether this was the work of Nazi fugitives maintaining a global presence or Soviet intelligence exploiting existing Nazi channels remains unresolved. The West first learned of Silver Anvil through defectors. In 1963, a Polish officer exfiltrated to the West, bringing word of Nazi archives discovered near Warsaw hidden until the 1950s. His testimony reached the CIA, which assigned analysts to investigate. By 1965, Langley's internal briefings noted the likelihood that a post-war clandestine organization, German in origin but possibly compromised by Soviet intelligence, operated in Eastern Europe under Allied observation. The briefing concluded with the chilling assessment. Presence of files dated beyond 1945 confirms deliberate falsification or continuity of hostile networks. Both scenarios represent strategic threat. Attempts to locate the Silver Anvil files after the Cold War proved frustrating. The Soviet Union's collapse opened some archives, but not the ones relating to this case. Researchers found scattered references, a 1962 KGB cable noting material of German character, compromising NATO individuals, and a 1964 Polish memo requesting additional security around the Otwock site. Beyond these fragments, the trail grows cold. Independent Polish historians who petitioned for access in the 1990s were denied, the files reportedly misplaced during archival transfers. Theories diverge sharply. Some argue the documents prove that elements of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, the Ausland SD, survived the war and continued underground operations, possibly funded by stolen assets hidden in neutral countries. Others suggest the Soviets manufactured the entire cache as disinformation, a trap designed to sow paranoia within Western intelligence by planting evidence of a Fourth Reich in hiding. The handwriting analysis, the food tins, and the unexplained South American dossiers muddy both narratives. What is clear is that Silver Anvil exposed a fissure in the historical record. Whether it was a genuine continuation of Nazi espionage or a Soviet fabrication, the discovery shook those who examined it. Intelligence officers understood that even the possibility of a surviving network, armed with detailed knowledge of Allied operatives and émigré communities, posed a psychological weapon. To this day, the true origin of the Otwock bunker remains classified, the files locked away, their pages accessible only to a handful of officials. The name Silver Anvil survives in Western intelligence circles as shorthand for unsolved Cold War mysteries, cases where the boundaries between Nazi remnants and Soviet deception blur beyond recognition. The truth may lie beneath layers of deliberate falsification, but one fact endures. In the early 1960s, in a quiet Polish forest, investigators opened a bunker door expecting relics of a dead war, and instead found evidence that the war had not ended at all. The war may have ended in 1945, but its shadows never surrendered. In locked archives and lakes without bottoms, the past still breathes, waiting for the wrong hands to open it. What survives in silence is not just memory, it is unfinished. Like a fuse never extinguished, and if the veil is lifted too far, what we call history might reveal itself as something far more dangerous, a secret still in motion.